All right, Service APIs meeting for January 13. And we've got a few issues to start off with here. The first one, actually, I looked through some of these in advance of this meeting just to refresh my memory. There's a lot of history on some of these, especially this one that dates back to May. And this is all about right now we're requiring listeners to be present on gateway spec and status. And as I understand this use case, for L4 gateways specifically, there's been a desire to link directly from gateway to backend, usually service, because the TCP and UDP routes we provide add overhead with fairly minimal value in at least some of the simpler use cases. So this conversation goes on for a bit here. Yeah, you can see Andrew actually worked through how they're doing it or how they plan to do it with their selector targeting a service directly. We did not formally support this in the API, but they had a creative way to make it work. And yeah, a lot of this conversation is still happening in May, where we're starting to think about TCP route, etc. And then it's basically just been kept on life support without a whole lot of action beyond that. So that is where we are right now. I think it is reasonable to do something to allow linking gateway to service or backend directly. I'm unsure whether or not that should involve listeners. So I appreciate Harry bringing this issue up. And I wanted to, this actually jogged my memory. I've been working on, or had a proposal sitting around that I just never formalized. And so I wrote up a doc that I think can be helpful here as far as how we might actually handle this linking. I know that this specific issue is about making listeners optional so you can have that direct link or make that direct link easier. And my proposal is to make that direct link official. And although they're not exactly the same thing, they seem very closely related. So yeah, that's where this one is at. I think I'm going to skip ahead because this is related and go through how I think this could be solved. And then maybe we can talk about the broader picture here and what might make sense. Hopefully everyone can see this. It's linked in the agenda. It looks like at least someone's here. So the idea I had was, and this is not a new idea or necessarily my idea to begin with. It's something like that I think Andrew and folks at VMware had been pushing for earlier on, like back in May. And this is finally me trying to figure out like what this could look like. And so my idea is, can we add some kind of forwarding shortcut that allows you to bypass routes for the simplest of use cases? This is especially intended for L4, but obviously we shouldn't make any decision for only a subset of protocols. This should apply broadly to any protocol you want. In all cases, I don't think the goal is to recreate advanced routing behavior at this level. It's not intended to include things like waiting, delegation to additional routes, traffic splitting. This is meant for the simplest of simple use cases where you have a gateway and you want to link it to a backend. Let's say it's a service or any other type of backend out there. So I outlined two potential options here. One would be to, in addition to the L4 shortcut use case, we could kind of repurpose this a bit and call it default backend. And for anyone who's familiar with Ingress, this is a very similar concept from Ingress, right? With Ingress, you have a default backend, and if nothing matches, the default backend is selected. And so this would, in the simplest of use case, if there are no routes selected, default backend serves all requests. But this could also work in the sense that if you have route selection, but your routes don't handle a specific request, you can use this default backend. So it's kind of two things. One, it's a default way to link without routes, or two, it can be a fallback if you do have routes selected, but they don't match a given request. The second option I kind of explored here would be, let's just call this backend reference, and let's make this a mutually exclusive behavior. You can either use a route selector or you can specify a backend, and let's just have this direct linking. So you can use routes or you cannot, and we won't muddy the water with the kind of in-between state that default backend provides. This is certainly simple and potentially easier to understand, but it does offer slightly less flexibility than the default backend approach above. And then below this, I had attempted to just describe how protocols would be actually understood with this kind of config, because you could argue, well, maybe you should have a protocol on default backend, but my idea has been that you can either rely on the listener protocol if the backend doesn't specify one, or if the backend does specify one, use that. So yeah, that is my line of thinking on this. I think if one of these options is compelling, it could dramatically help solve this issue. Any thoughts on this? Any preference between approaches? Does either approach seem reasonable?
My preference would be that it be exclusive, because that is the easiest to validate, and that we don't have to add another level of conflict handling.
What kind of that's good good feedback. What kind of conflict handling would default backend add?
Because it implies that there's a catch-all match, and then that is in addition to the routes that you configure.
Right. So yeah, I guess what you're saying is if there's a route that is a catch-all and you have a default backend specified, you need to add some additional logic there, basically to say route gets priority over default backend or something like that.
I think in a combination with the protocol selection, it just it feels like it's going to introduce a lot of complexity in edge cases.
Okay, that's fair. Does anyone else feel strongly between option A and B, this kind of exclusive behavior?
Yeah, I would agree with Bowie. I mean, I think I lean towards option B for the conflict handling issue.
Okay, that's great feedback. And sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so do we, I mean, option B kind of indicates that the default route will continue to be this kind of implicit thing that
Yeah.
if there is at least one, route that matches everything, that'll be it. But if there's multiple everything routes, then they'll conflict. And I just want to say, that's kind of a decision we're making. Are we okay with that?
I think that's a really good point. Thanks for calling that out. And as much as this helps solve conflict handling and implementation, it could result in a more common scenario where there are multiple catch-all routes because somebody was some user of this API was trying to implement catch-all and didn't realize they already had a catch-all and tried to do another one. And
right, but we're not removing that unless you're saying we remove that somehow.
no, well,
I don't know if this strictly makes it. I think this seems to be strictly the same.
so I agree we're not necessarily removing it, but if there were an option outside of routes to provide a catch-all, then it seems like it would be less likely that users would
Right,
use
but you'd
routes
still
as
have
a
to handle
catch-all.
that case, so it doesn't.
You would.
Like just because you're pushing people towards a certain direction, it doesn't prevent it from happening. So you have to handle it anyways. So the complexity
absolutely.
doesn't.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I completely agree that as far as implementation complexity, option B is simpler. What I am suggesting is that for user experience, with option A, users may be less likely to run into a situation where weird conflict resolution happens.
But
where
you'd
there
still
are
have
two
to handle
catch-all
that
routes.
case,
Oh,
and the
yeah.
user would still have to understand that. So I don't know if it really bought you anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, if they didn't have the route here, then it would still go to that default route, right? If they didn't use it in this default backend. And I also kind of like it feels like this option A feels like a special case just to do default routes.
Yeah.
Which seems kind of strange. And so I kind of like the black and whiteness of you either do routes or you have the backend ref, and it keeps it much simpler, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. That it seems like there's good support for option B. Would anyone prefer that we didn't add something like this? Like, does this muddy up or complicate the API in any way that feels uncomfortable?
Yeah, I was just refreshing my memory on listeners, looking at the listeners Go doc. So is a use case where we want this behavior at the listener level? So some listeners would be, layer 7 listeners using routes, and other listeners would be layer 4 listeners.
That's a good question. So as I've defined it, it is at the listener level. Obviously, the way that this issue defines it, they're asking for optional listeners, because as I understand how they implemented this, they had either annotations or labels on the gateway itself that referred to a service backend. I can't remember the specifics, but for them, and I'm not sure if this is exactly where you were going, but for them, I think they were doing a gateway links to a single backend. And what I'm proposing is a gateway listener can link to a single backend, which is a bit different. Is that the issue or the difference you were noting? Or
well, what I'm thinking is, if it's not at the listener level, then we kind of bring it up a level, and it removes some of the ambiguity of having that behavior within a listener, right? Because a listener defines a host name that I would think is most likely irrelevant for layer 4 load balancing. We of course have the routes field there. from the implementation side, like we've only kind of discussed how we plan on supporting layer 4, and so currently our plans are that we'd actually use a separate implementation for layer 4 load balancing. And so when I think about that, like the simpler the gateway API for exposing layer 4 load balancing, the better. Right, so we would have separate gateway classes and gateways for our layer 7 load balancing and our layer 4 load balancing. And a gateway for a layer 7 load balancer would instantiate a contour environment, for example, and then a gateway instantiation for the layer 4 gateway class would instantiate some layer 3, 4 load balancer. So I mean, just think maybe we should consider actually having something in maybe a gateway spec field that says, okay, when gateway spec defines, I don't know, maybe gateway type, a type or something like that. If type is L4, then I don't know if listeners are no longer used, or I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
go ahead.
I think that's interesting. I think one, we do still have, and I should say that I think that's going to be a common thing, a differentiation between L4 and L7 load balancing implementations. One thing that routes give us, I think it's really the primary thing at this point, is some level of L4 traffic splitting. How common that will be is unclear, but it is something that routes and listeners provide. The other thing that I would assume we would want with a L4 load balancer is still this concept of the protocol you should listen on and the port. I'm assuming.
Yes, I agree.
And so some form of the listener concept still feels relevant here. Oh yeah, okay, good point, Bowie. That Linkerd or something could use L4 splitting. Okay.
Isn't it like one of the primary use cases? They have an object that annotates a service that splits it.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not familiar.
And I haven't looked at your document here in detail. It's kind of the first time I've looked at it. So we have these like listener rules, right? Where like each listener has to have a unique combination of what like name and port and protocol, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
So
I can't remember what the third value is. It might be host name, protocol, and port. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it, but don't hold me to it. So let's say that is the uniqueness required for a listener, or merging the listeners or what have you.
Yeah.
Have you thought through in this proposal how that would affect that kind of those rules?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is still fine, assuming that you would again still have a single L4 listener on port 80, let's say, or whatever port it happens to be. That protocol and port are going to be unique for that gateway. Like I think that still is generic enough uniqueness requirement that it would be true. Yeah, but maybe I'm missing some other potential conflict scenarios.
Well, and I haven't thought through this, but I know like just some of the basic testing, right, is like, okay, instantiated gateway class gateway and HTTP route and the gateway. I either don't specify host name or specify the wildcard character, right? So it's kind of like, the default ingress example, and everything works. And now I say, okay, well, I want to be able to have a separate listener that's a layer 4 listener. I wouldn't necessarily define a host name, right, for my layer 4 listener. Right, Rob?
Right.
So I'd say, okay, on port whatever protocol, I don't know if we even specify that, is TCP maybe. What? We have no TLS config. We have no routes. So I guess how would the gateway know, like, to use layer 7 behavior and forward it to, a route that's specified for the one listener that is using the wildcard character, and route, I guess it would need to be on a separate port then. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. I'm just thinking out
so
loud.
what you're describing is, let's say you have a L7 listener and L4 listener on the same port, because we allow unique values of host name. So one has a host name and the other doesn't. So it's technically not a conflict. Yeah, okay. That's a good point. I think that's solvable, but it's definitely not something that I thought about as I was writing this out.
I distinctly remember we discussed this, so maybe we can look back at the notes. This has come up before.
Yeah.
I think the conclusion was that the controller would just say this is disallowed.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable. I mean, this feels like enough of an edge case to say that it is disallowed. But I'll have to go back through any documents or issues we have around this to see if we've actually written that out anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, like I think just thinking about some implementations, they just can't do it. So it very much we'd have to allow that option to just say, hey, this is not a valid config.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because there will be many implementations that simply can't support both at the same time anyway. So yeah, that makes sense.
One other point too with the backend ref, Rob, is like,
yeah.
We're basically saying for option B, user specifies backend ref to point to a service, and if I understood correctly, option B says, okay, when a user does that, routes are now ignored. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. This is
so
exclusive, and one would have to have precedence. I'm assuming we would give precedence to backend ref over route selector, but I don't know. Okay. Could be either way.
And maybe something to consider is instead of backend ref is like something override, or route override, and just so to me it's like very clear to the user that when they set this option, they're essentially overriding the routing behavior and just forwarding to whatever reference is specified there, which sounds like it's just going to be a service, or would we want to support other types?
I didn't explicitly say this here, but my intent was for this backend ref to be the same type that we use for forward to. So it includes service name, port, and then a object reference as well. So pick whatever you want. And to clarify, forward to without wait. There's I think that's what we use in some other use cases. Yeah, what we use for backend policy, that backend reference. Yeah, I don't know about naming here, because if we make it too specific to overriding routes, then like we want it to make sense on its own, right? And if someone is unaware of routes and I just see YAML that, you know, looks like this as an example, this doesn't feel like it's overriding anything. It just feels like it is a thing. But I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
now that I think about it, I do agree with you, because again, unless I misunderstood, is what is it? The routes of a listener would now be optional, and
Yeah.
so a listener could be just a backend ref, correct?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, all right. Yep, no, I agree. Let's just go ahead and strike what I said about renaming.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think this makes sense. Let me go back. I'll add a reference to this this doc and this idea and this issue. Maybe I should create another issue around this. And then I'll let it soak for maybe a week or so just to see if we get any more feedback around this, and if it still seems reasonable a week from now, I or anyone can work on an implementation of this. This is the kind of change that I think is almost back. You know, it's fully additive, but I guess because we're making a field optional, maybe not quite backwards compatible. But anyways, close. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the great feedback on this. I'll make some notes and update this a little bit to indicate that option B seems to be the preference here. Yeah. And let me keep on running here unless there was anything else to say on that front. Cool. All right, so the next one, it's actually an issue from you, Danian, around consistent defaulting for status. I think we're close now. I don't know, Danian, do you know if there's still work left to be done on this one?
Oh, it's a good point. I don't know. I haven't looked at this in a while.
Okay.
See through it. Can we go to that number 308 and maybe that'll spark some more ideas for me here?
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Thank you. So this fixed one default, and there was concern at that point that maybe we were missing other defaults.
Yeah, for some of the other resources, right?
Yeah, when we moved to meta v1 condition, these additional fields became required. And so we have better testing now, so we know at the very least that our defaulting shouldn't be causing any errors, but we don't know that we're not missing a default somewhere. That's harder to identify. I guess it's pretty straightforward. We can just run through each status condition and make sure we either have a default set or we really just don't need one, and run from there.
Since you have the issue up, can you throw that in the chat window? I'll do a quick pass through of this since I opened it, and then I can go from there.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. All right. The next one is 114. This was a much larger discussion that also has a lot of history here. This was the idea of pluggable access control. I tried to read through this again before the meeting, and there was a good discussion of how we could do this in some kind of standardized way. And, this idea of, hey, can we have a authorization field in our spec that takes a URL, some kind of timeout, and we can understand that. And I know Harry referenced some additional docs. I think this was, again, this is a while ago, but this was when we had actions, which then moved to filters. And so this was all in that discussion. You can see this continuing on of, hey, can we do an extension ref with this? One of the points as we went further down is there really is no standard way to do this. Every implementation is going to have a different way of plugging in authorization. So it's going to be relatively difficult to make it, truly generic and truly portable. And unfortunately, what has happened since then is this has kind of fallen off. It looks like in July, there was a little bit of extra work. This is, again, the action proposal that changed to filters. And then it just kind of fell off. A little bit of discussion here about how we could mirror what cloud providers are doing. And then just, hey, can we do a POC? And nothing after that. So it sounds like we're open to POCs, but nobody has the time or effort to time available to really create a POC around this or dive further into what this looks like. I would love if we could find a standard way to do this. Anyone interested? Anyone have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the onus would be on someone to create a proposal that is reasonably or conceivably could be portable, as opposed to asking to support a specific thing, because you can always support a specific thing with the current set of extensions. To loft it to the level where we put it as part of the API, probably it requires someone to do that legwork.
Yeah, and to Bowie's point, I know Joachim, which is, what's his name, J.M. Prusi, in this issue. He and I have had several discussions, and to Bowie's point, that is exactly what I told Joachim to do, is start off creating a proposal, and actually gave him some references to proposals that the community has created in the past. So Rob, maybe it's a good idea for you to comment in issue 114, if you don't mind, just, restating that, saying, hey, the community's interested in this. Joachim or Evan, or can you work on putting a proposal together and presenting it during a community call?
Yeah, that makes sense. I will. I'll follow up after this with them just on this thread, because it does seem like there's broad interest, but it's a relatively complex thing to get right. So, proposal would be a good start. All right. Any last comments on this one? Cool. I'll follow up soon. And the last one is a newer issue, and I think the broader discussion is probably on this parameters ref PR. Damian, why don't you give the background on this?
Yeah, so I've been busy with implementation, and the way that the controller currently works is it uses a custom resource that is namespace scoped to instantiate a contour environment. And this contour custom resource is essentially holds all the configuration needed for our implementation. And the challenge we have here is that, well, gateway class would really reference this contour, and we're going to add a field to contour. The field basically says, who's this contour managed by, and if it's managed by a gateway class, then the controller will not go ahead and instantiate an entire contour environment, because when it's managed by a gateway class, right, it now will look for the gateway class, will look for a gateway, and when it sees a gateway, it'll instantiate a contour environment based on the gateway class and contour. And so, the way that I've proceeded, and there was some confusion there, where if you look at parameters ref is a local object ref, if you look at the local object ref, and it says, in a no namespace. And so I said, okay, well, the way that the controller works now is, again, it's looking for this contour resource in a particular namespace. And the way, I guess one of the reasons that's done is like when you stand up the operator, which the controller is within this operator, right, a software operator, that runs in a particular namespace, and it will ignore, any user that tries to create a contour that's outside of its namespace. So, the intent is, hey, an administrator creates the namespace to run the operator in, and the administrator creates instances of this contour custom resource, and it should be namespace and scope in the same namespace that the contour operator runs in. And so, we're just trying to get away from saying, okay, let's create a new custom resource that's essentially the same as the existing custom resource. And the only difference is that it's, globally scoped. And we, as part of that too, is we thought, oh, wow, maybe there's a use case for going ahead and saying, taking existing contour environments, and with the new version that's released that supports service APIs, that users can go ahead and say, hey, let's just enable these contour environments to use service APIs, simply update your existing CRD and set this particular field. And now that contour environment will be managed by service API, gateway class, gateway, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks for that background, and I think that's a really interesting and I think fairly compelling use case for how you're doing that. My concern here was that obviously the gateway and gateway class relationship is really closely tied to the ingress and ingress class relationship before it, and ideally if we changed one, we would change the other. I guess this is specifically related to the parameters reference from class to parameters. But we've had discussions before around ingress class parameters upstream, and there had been some interest in namespace scope parameters at the time. It was mostly tied to config maps as parameters. And at that time, it was generally just not popular enough to be considered worthwhile. So I am frustrated that there's not a better written record of this. There is, there were a variety of discussions in meetings. I think there was an Ingress working group meeting where we discussed this, and then shortly after a SIG network meeting on May 28. And of course, it's not recorded because why would it be? Every other meeting is uploaded, but the May 28 one is not. But I remember that it was a pretty quiet discussion, in the sense that there wasn't a whole lot of feedback one way or the other. I think it was primarily a discussion between myself and Tim and maybe a couple others.
I think the reason it was quiet is no one had gotten to implementing it.
Yes, I think that's exactly what it is. And at the time, there just wasn't a lot of support for a namespace field on that params ref. And there was a lot of pushback towards the idea of config map versus CRD. because, you know, a CRD allows validation and all these other things. And although it's a bit of a pain, it is a net benefit. What you're describing is actually a little bit unique in that it's a namespace scope CRD. And so that automatically removes some of the pushback that we had back then. I'll also say I was not the strongest champion of this. I just, you know, this was something that came up and I raised it, and there wasn't a whole lot more support. And so, you know, we stayed at status quo. I think this is worth bringing up at the next SIG network meeting just to see if we can champion change there.
Yeah, I think like this is sort of broader than SIG network. It's more of like an API's conventions kind of thing. For example, the kind of issues that I am thinking of is like, does this break RBAC or like potentially security policies in some way? Does this make the controllers have to like watch more than they should in terms of permissions? Basically issues like that. Not specific for networking per se.
Yeah, I was trying to think that through too. The cluster scoped resource referring to a namespace scoped resource seems like a relatively rare thing, but RBAC itself does this. If you think about a cluster role binding being bound to a service account, that is or can be a reference to a namespace scoped resource from a cluster scoped one. Yes, that it is something like that feels a little off. But that the specific use case Danian has presented is interesting to me. I'm interested if we can maybe compile a few more. I know Harry had specifically mentioned further up this that maybe a config map would be compelling in some cases too. I'm less sold on config map here. But the specific idea of namespace scope CRD seems relatively reasonable to me, at least how it's being used here.
Yeah, I tend to support that. I just don't know what the full implications of are, or like if the API conventions folks have some strong reason why. Trying to remember what the decision was. I think it was just that it was simpler.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I remember this is, and Chris, you were involved in this design too. Do you remember any of the discussion around this?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay. All right. Yeah. The way I'm remembering this initial discussion is that keeping resource references at the same scope is always simpler. And unless there's a very compelling reason, you know, and we just couldn't come up with that very compelling reason. At least config maps were not it, but maybe this is. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I do think, you know, config maps, because it's an option that we consider on the implementation side as well. And it's like, okay, well, we already have this CRD created, and aside from it being namespace scope, you know, we prefer using it since it's, you know, structured. But I could see an implementer that's like, hey, you know, configuration is just a bunch of key value pairs. Why not just use a config map?
Yeah, and I almost think that's a bit of a concern too, in the sense that when there is an easy way out, the easy way out will be chosen. And I think that CRDs will provide a better user experience, especially if they provide a list of available fields in their actual spec and some form of validation associated with it, both of which are pretty difficult to achieve with config maps. But I recognize that doesn't have to be a blocker on this.
Well, help me understand what you mean, available fields.
Well, just so if you have a schema associated with the CRD, it's easy to see what you can actually set. Where a config map, you can set anything, and it's similar problem to annotations. You know, if you've worked with Ingress controllers that require a great deal of annotations, you've likely made a typo at some point and not understood why the thing you're doing isn't working. And it's, you know, there's no validation. At least with CRDs, you can drop fields if they're not supported, you know, like basic things that make the user experience a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think from the mind of like a simple implementation. Again, you know, I don't know how the rest of the community feels, but it's like, you know, it's nice not having to support CRD, and you know, my specific use case having to create almost an identical CRD is really something we want to try and avoid. And I think you know, with some of the benefits is like, okay, I mean, the config map on its own, you know, there's some limitations there, but if it's being referenced by like a gateway class, maybe there's logic in the gateway class controller that can go ahead and say, oh, you know, something is wrong here with the configuration, and then surface that status condition in the gateway class saying, you know, like invalid parameters ref, and then pop in some.
Yeah, you're right, and we do already have that condition reason, whatever it is.
Right.
So yeah, that is definitely possible. So yeah, it probably isn't the end of the world. There is the ideal implementation, but then also the realistic one, and need to keep them both in mind. Don't want this API to be too much of a pain to actually implement.
Yeah, I'd say it would be hard for us to prevent someone from using config map anyways.
Yeah.
Unless we have some like seal of quality that we pass over all the implementations.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We can't really control parameters. They are outside of scope for any kind of conformance tests or anything. Yeah.
And I think it's just good that we provide some flexibility, especially, you know, early on in the APIs. I mean, so this issue is going to be discussed in the Contour community later on this afternoon, where we're hoping to finalize the implementation plan, and this is obviously one of the topics that will be discussed. So if there's a shift at all, I'll update you know, the issue here. But I'd be surprised if it is. We really want to avoid duplicating the current CRD just to make it cluster scope.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would really appreciate any effort that could be given towards pushing for this in Ingress as well. What I'm trying to avoid is, you know, these very slight variations between gateway class and Ingress class when they have the same field, but one allows namespace references and the other doesn't. And also just getting this to a broader audience would help us understand if there are other things that we haven't thought about. Like Bowie mentioned, if there are implications we're unaware of this kind of cluster scope resource referencing a namespace scope 1, if it'll get us into trouble.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a great example of you know, cluster role referencing a namespace service account, right?
Yeah.
So I guess to because, and I do agree, right? Ingress class, gateway class. I agree that let's, you know, keep those as similar as possible. So I agree with you there. So are you able to help me on the Ingress class side and having that discussion?
Yeah.
If it's with SIG network or whatever.
Yeah, I'll definitely be involved in that. I just, as I showed on May 28, I am not the best champion of this topic. So having more people that are more invested in this would be helpful. But yeah,
I think
I'm
one.
definitely.
So we would just add an optional namespace, and if it's not present, it's cluster scoped or something in the reference. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. If it seems natural, but then yeah, I don't know if it's been done.
Yeah, that's the cluster role binding example I gave, I think, is purely a namespace scope reference. I don't know. I can't think of a hybrid reference off the top of my head. So this may end up becoming a larger discussion than we intend. But it would be good to get it right.
And if the pushback is that, oh no, we don't like this hybrid model, pick one or the other, is that an issue for other implementers?
I think it's too late to pick one or the other because at least for Ingress, because Ingress class already exists.
Yep. I was just thinking gateway class, so, my bad.
Yeah. And admittedly, we could do something different for gateway class, but then I think we just reach all kinds of confusion.
Yeah.
You know, one of the ideas was maybe there's a way that implementations can use the same parameters for Ingress class and gateway class. That may not actually end up making sense for a lot of implementations, but maybe it could. And if one ends up being namespace scope and the other doesn't, all kinds of complications. Okay. Well, the next SIG network meeting should be a week away on Thursday. I can add something to the agenda, but certainly if anyone who is invested in this can be present as well to be part of the discussion, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll do my best, and if I need to maybe have a follow-up attendance of SIG network to continue.
Sounds good.
Urging for my use case, and I'll do that. I'm just like so up to my ears on the implementation side. The short timeline, so I'm really trying to focus in on that. Then when we hopefully, I think around April, good to go there, then I'll free up my time.
Cool. Awesome. Let me just we don't have much else to go through. Oh yes, thank you, Chris. You've added a lot of work on this webhook. Chris, do you want to just give a status update on where you are and what you need from us?
Sure. I mean, there's the PR for actually having this live within inside of the K8's official container registry. That is linked here. That one I removed James just because he has not responded yet to that linked PR. So I am setting a reminder for myself just to email him to get him added so that we can have parity with the owner's file. But that will allow me to actually push this to the official repository. It has all the scaffolding needed, as well as the first kind of set of changes, or I think there's like 3 parts. This is one that I thought was the most straightforward to get in first. So I'd like to merge this one, and then in 2 subsequent PRs, I could do the other 2. The one thing, so there is a comment about the map, like for this specific filter, we're checking for duplicate instances of core or extended filters. But what I don't know is, how do we validate whether something is of type extended or implementation specific? Is there some helper and group validator for that?
Oh, I see. I see what you mean. No, there is not. I don't know. Maybe I'm misremembering this, but I don't know that it's significant whether something is core or extended support for this, or were we saying that we would allow duplicate filters if they were of type extended? Was that the idea?
Yeah, that was the comment from Harry.
Okay. Oh, that is tricky. All right. I don't have a good answer for that because we have not solved that, and yeah. Okay, that
I can certainly mark a to-do to solve, because I believe for this to go probably even to beta, that's something that we're going to have to solve soonish, because it's one of the big selling points of V2 as
yeah.
far as. But I think at this moment, there's going to be, whether I create the helper method now to do those things, there's going to need to be something keeping track of a list somewhere. So
Yeah.
that is why.
Yeah, and I mean, what we don't want to have happen is to add a new filter type that we consider core and somehow forget about this webhook, right? And so then our validation completely skips over this type or whatever it is.
Right.
What do you remember what file that comment thread is on?
It would
I
be
probably
under the
just got here.
validator.
Yeah.
Yep, that's
Yeah,
it.
thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I had missed that that part about and that's why you're specifically tracking each individual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I'll need to think about this some more, but you're completely right there. We do not have a good way to differentiate. I guess a safe initial way would be to just say, regardless of the filter type, you can only have one. And then as we get requests for more duplicate filter types, let's say, we can revisit this and add support for multiple extended filters here. But yeah, that's my initial thought, but I know we're already over time. Okay. But let me follow up. If anyone else has thoughts on how we should handle this, definitely. This is PR 506. Definitely add your thoughts here as well. Yeah, and by the way, thanks for all the work on this. It's exciting to actually have a webhook implementation so close to ready here.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think Bowie needs to. It might be the only person, at least currently, Bowie or Tim. That would be able to approve that linked PR.
Where?
Okay, yeah. Let me take a look at that. Sorry, I was on vacation, so.
Yeah, no problem.
No, it's I forget which. If you can drop that in chat or Slack or somewhere. Yeah. There's so much activity in here, so.
I will post it in Slack.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk to you a week from now.
Thanks, Rob.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.